I have too many things to thank Michael and Victor for, aside from putting this together. So I'll thank everyone who joined us on behalf. Yeah. This paper is sort of the highest level theoretical stuff in my dissertation stripped out and like kind of rendered just as sort of theory. So there's like a lot more of it. So I welcome questions, and I'll be grateful for the help thinking through it. Some of the examples I'll talk about are the examples from the dissertation, but also I brought in some others that I thought would just be like quicker to and maybe more relevant for our broader conversation. So I will go. What makes the critical musicologies ultimately critical is their willingness to criticize the concept of music itself. This has been, in fact, one of the major accomplishments of the discipline's 20th century histories. Through a series of critical irruptions, the development of ethnomusicology, the rebellion of the new musicology, and the arrival of sound studies, the music concept has been subjected to sustained and repeated scrutiny. The result is that today, critical skepticism of music has become more or less standard fare. Broadly, the critique of music travels along two intertwined paths. If I could have the next slide. Thank you. On the one hand, music is unmasked as a false universal, a modern Western peculiarity masquerading as a stable, trans-historical, culturally unvarying category. This strand of critique is a particular strength of ethnomusicology, which has so richly documented the diversity of the world's sonic practices and concepts, not all of which, as we know, are precisely music. So for an example of this, we can mention Charles Kyle, who, noting the absence in TIV of an exact equivalent to the English word music, writes that, quote, "What seems to us, i.e. Westerners, a very basic, useful, and rather concrete term is apparently a useless abstraction from a TIV, Yoruba, perhaps even a Pan-African or non-Western point of view," end quote. But similar conclusions have also been reached through historical studies of the West itself, as in Gary Tomlinson's reflections on the fundamental otherness of the European past via a study of music and magic in the Renaissance. The other strand of the critique takes aim at music as a mystifying reification. It alleges that the notion of an object or a domain called music misleadingly distracts from the truth that what we call music is actually just a series of practices enmeshed in social contexts. Again, ethnomusicology has been important with its detailed studies of the concrete activities of people and communities in their everyday lives. But perhaps most influential, the next slide, has been Christopher Small's argument that music ought to be replaced with his somehow supposedly less reifying coinage, musicking. And one more. Like Kyle, Small too names abstraction as the enemy in his attempt to bring musicological thinking back down to earth. He summarizes his argument with the bracing assertion that really, quote, "there's no such thing as music," end quote. This claim that there's no such thing as music also doubles as an only slightly oversimplified gloss on the critique of music writ large. At the very least, it points usefully to efforts to explore language and concepts other than music in the musicologies, such as turns toward the plural musics, or toward the sonic, or to raise some examples that have come out of BU, Marier's sound business and Michael's sounded poetics, for example. Likewise, work in the musicologies has sought out other foci beyond music per se, right? Scenes, subcultures, individuals, genres, markets, technologies, and so on, all the things that are like actually studied now instead of music. What I would like to attempt this morning, however, is to critique the critique of music, something in the manner of a horror story. My claim is that there really is such a thing as music, and that thing is even worse than the critique of music has proposed. If the refrain that there is no such thing as music calls to mind the image of a frightened child with her eyes closed, fists clenched, incanting, "There's no such thing as ghosts. There's no such thing as ghosts," then my dare is that we look under the bed to see for real. My argument hinges on the issue of abstraction. In the critique of music, the problem with abstraction is said to be that it's a faulty and epistemically violent way of thinking. And the next slide, please. However, drawing on the Marxian and post-Marxian concept of real abstraction, I want to suggest that music is not just an abstract idea in the minds and works of scholars, but a historically emergent abstract entity that actually has its own agency in the world. As such, the problem is less the wanton application of music as a concept and the epistemic violence that does, than it is that music has a direct coercive power over cultural and social life all its own. In what follows, I'd like to briefly and somewhat partially flesh out these claims, along the way introducing some terms and concepts I've been working with as I've tried to think about music as a real abstraction in this way. And then in closing, I'll quickly suggest how all this might be useful in this moment of disciplinary crossings, and I hope that might lead to some further conversation. So for theorists of real abstraction, the abstract is real because it is a result of social practice, not directly a result of thinking. People positioned in specific social roles act, that is, do things in a certain way, such that their practices give rise to and depend on abstract entities. It is only then, after abstract practices have been developed, that abstractions in thought follow as a kind of trace. For the same reason, real abstractions are also historical. They exist in and through real events happening in the flow of time. For all this to occur, however, particular kinds of actions and practices are required. In the passage of the Grundrisse that has given rise to the theory of real abstraction, Marx explains that abstraction is a result of what he calls, quote, the concentration of many determinations, hence the unity of the diverse, end quote. In other words, abstraction in this sense arises in situations where many different and particular things are brought together into close contact, a situation that Edouard Glissant might call one of relation. Abstraction itself then occurs when that which all these particular and different things have in common precipitates out of their intermingling. Again, Marx, quote, one thing appears as common to many, to all, end quote. This one thing, this common precipitate, makes itself known as it comes to govern the practical relation between the diverse things. It functions, in other words, as an agent, and for this reason is real. The classic illustration of real abstraction in the Marxian tradition is value. Value is not something first thought up in the human mind, but rather it developed because of the historical appearance of market exchange. In a marketplace, quantities of diverse commodities, differences, are concentrated so that they can be exchanged. In contrast to simple bartering, where I need only contemplate how much of my wheat I'm willing to part with to obtain the quantity of your firewood that I need. The quantity of your firewood that I need. In the density of the market, such one-to-one calculations are quickly overwhelmed by the need to exchange any given commodity for any and all others. What emerges as a solution is that all commodities share the common characteristic that they take a certain amount of time to make or obtain, meaning that each can be quantitatively compared to any other on this basis. This abstract quantitative quality is called value, and its realness consists in the way that it in fact governs market exchange. Not only that, Marxists would add, but with the development of the world market and the world system, the value form has come to govern human social life and reproduction writ large. So like music, like value, music in the sense that I'm considering and that the critique of music criticizes has a particular historical genesis. This music is distinctly modern. Julian Johnson, drawing on a number of other scholars, has convincingly argued that a long musical modernity began sometime around 1600 and persists into the present day, claims of postmodernism notwithstanding. The work of many scholars involved in the recent global turn in historical musicology has made clear why this is so. In short, the reason is globalization. Here is David Irving in his landmark Colonial Counterpoint, quote, early modern globalization at first increased the diversity of musics known and practiced in societies that were linked to global networks of exchange and commerce. But this heterogeneity gave way over time to a standardization or homogeneity that was enforced by imperial hegemony, end quote. I think we could already hear in David's apt summary of globalization's effects on music as it gave rise to capitalist imperialist modernity, something that rhymes with the description of real abstraction I gave a few minutes ago. Globalization, from its early form into the present, networks the world's sonic cultures in a way that establishes a concentration of differences through exchange, mobility, migration, imitation, representation, commodification, and so on. This, I want to suggest, is the crucial historical step that made possible music as a real abstraction. Music in this sense might be defined as the doing and understanding of one's sonic and embodied practices in relation to those of other people, times, and places. Of course, such circumstances have certainly always existed. Villagers have always learned the songs of the people across the valley or around the river bend. Or, for example, Johannes de Grocaio, writing from Paris around 1300, was certainly aware of the many musical differences that dotted Europe in his day. Quote, "The parts of music are many and diverse, according to diverse uses, diverse idioms, or diverse languages in diverse cities or regions," end quote. But while a kind of incipient musical relationality far predates the early modern period, it's only with early modern globalization that this begins to become a pervasive condition. Again, this is a point that the global history of music makes quite clear. We could think of the work of any number of scholars, some of whom are here. But for an image of the density of the first musical globalization that for me is indelible, let me again draw on David, who writes of a 1593 Portuguese visit to the Japanese regent Hideyoshi, during which a group of African musicians performed dance music on fife and drum. So think about how many sonic cultures are coming together here. This example also allows me to emphasize a crucial point. By arguing for an understanding of music that grounds it explicitly in modernity's networking of global practices that are not or are not yet music, I'm decidedly moving away from definitions of music as a particularly European practice or ideology that has been simply imposed on the rest of the globe. I find this unhelpful theoretically and not so true empirically in ways that I'm happy to talk more about later. But at the same time, it's of course essential to account for European and later North American hegemony within music. After all, the African musicians who played for the Japanese regent were assuredly enslaved by the Portuguese. This is to say that while music is a diverse network, it's not a rhizomatic one. Rather, Europe has controlled what I call the terms and channels that construct music's network, placing itself as the hub through which access to the network flows. It's in this topographic sense that music is literally, materially Eurocentric. And the next slide, just an early modern example of Europe constructing itself right as the hub of this network, and sort of all ethnographic thinking about things that are not yet music work in this way, even into the present, right? It's also kind of what ethnomusicology continues to do. But if music as real abstraction begins from the concentration of different sonic practices and understandings, then how does the moment of abstraction itself work? To answer, I'd like to move ahead a bit in time and to zoom in on an illustration from the colonial Caribbean, a place that scholars have long recognized as crucial to the construction of modernity in all its facets. I have the next slide. Richard Liggin's A True and Exact History of the Island of Barbados, published here in London in 1657, draws on the author's experience as a plantation manager for the planter Thomas Modiford between the years 1647 and 1650. And the next slide. In this account, Liggin describes his experiences with an enslaved man named Macau, whom he names as the plantation's, quote, chief musician. On one particular occasion, Macau entered the plantation house to find Liggin practicing the theorbo. And the instrument intrigued Macau, and after Liggin was finished playing, Macau picked up the theorbo and began to experiment with it, playing along a single string by stopping it at each fret, that is, ascending the string by constant half step. A few days later, Liggin writes, he found Macau sitting in a grove constructing an instrument out of wood, the description of which suggests a marimba. The instrument had 6 keys, apparently tuned to a pentatonic scale. Liggin claims that he then showed Macau how to expand the scale by the addition of new pitches located that half step away from some of the existing tones. In other words, how to convert this pentatonic marimba into a diatonic one. So adding the leading tone and adding fa to, I guess, like a major pentatonic scale. That seems to be what's going on in this passage. This passage of Liggin's True and Exact History has attracted a fair amount of scholarly interest. Typically, it's interpreted in terms of Caribbean hybridity and creolization, as it documents the transfer of the African marimba to the New World and apparently captures European and African musical systems meeting and blending. But I want to read it instead as evidence not of creolization or hybridity, but of musicalization, of the production of modern music in the first place through real abstraction. Previous readings have curiously missed that beneath Ligon's patronizing tone, the anecdote is a thinly veiled retelling of the foundational Western myth of Pythagoras and the harmonious blacksmith, with Macau recast in the Pythagorean role, right down to the use of a monochord. This is, in fact, a story about the discovery or invention of music as such. And Macau, like Pythagoras, discovers music through an experience of abstraction. While concepts of hybridity or creolization emphasize the combination of forms that are assumed to be fundamentally different to one another, a European scale on one side and an African instrument on the other. But the concept of real abstraction helps to make salient that what was actually happening for Macau was the discovery of what his practice and Ligon's had in common. His investigation into theorbo playing among the whites revealed that, like him, they organized sound through a measured system of pitch, although one with different features to his own. This moment of abstraction is crucial because it is actually the basis on any subsequent hybridization that might happen is made possible. An important corollary of this theory of music as real abstraction is that music grows. And this is where the horror story really begins for me. As Panagiotis Sotiris has pointed out, glossing Roberto Finelli, abstraction works, quote, according to the exigencies of its expansive reproductive logic. Music grows in several ways. On the one hand, it expands to subsume ever greater swaths of physical and cultural geography. At the same time, music also grows by accumulating non-music, increasingly acquiring more of the sonic world. Finally, and partly as a result of the accumulation, music grows by making more out of what it already contains, a kind of increase in musical productivity and efficiency. This growth happens in and across many dimensions, and we could sort of even look at some of the examples I've already given to find it. But let me raise another. Consider music's expansion in terms literally of amplitude. In the European 15th century, as Coelho and Polk explain, the musical instrumentarium was divided into soft and loud categories, where soft was, say, the lute, and loud was only as loud as the trumpet. By the 20th century, however, this range had expanded dramatically, with Cajun silence at one end and the massive speakers of Caribbean sound trucks at the other. This is a really literal example of what I'm calling music's growth. Music's growth is not automatic, but results from the particular activities of particular people in given historical circumstances, who may encourage or enable it in various ways for various reasons. Nor does music's growth go unnoticed or uncontested. In fact, perhaps the most common reaction to music's growth is what I've taken to calling discontent, which motivates everything, I think, from actually music scholarship itself to outright efforts to resist the riptide pull of music. These aspects of music's tendency to grow appear particularly acutely in colonial and post-colonial situations, where the expansion of music has been so profoundly fraught and where music has found so much non-music to swallow up. So for an example of someone encouraging music's growth in one of these situations, the next slide shows how in 1966, one Nigerian amateur of music, Martin Cisse, wrote into the newly independent country's leading periodical to encourage Nigerian composers to vigorously participate in music's growth. Cisse calls on them to leverage training in Western music to, quote, build upon already existing Nigerian tunes, end quote, and to make, end quote, to make use of the latent powers of our musical instruments, end quote. For Cisse, participating in the global network of music and expanding it, in fact, in this way, will allow Nigeria to announce itself on the world stage as finally a nation among equals. Participating in music's growth is useful to him. Yeah, next slide, thanks. At other times, however, music's growth has been assiduously refused. Writing in the context of what he calls, quote, empire's phono extractions, end quote, Lester Hu urges attention to those musical resistors who, quote, did not have their utterances recorded by a phonograph, who could not or would not satiate the transcendent ear, who moved to or fell through the cracks amid the global formation of markets, colonies, imperial identifications, and area studies, end quote. As another example here of resistors, I think of rap. Although today rap appears as the most astonishing demonstration of music's growth, When it was first developed in the 1970s and 80s, rap was, as Trisha Rose so precisely put it, black noise. It was not music, but a way of using music, of signifying on music, and thereby separating itself from music. As Rose quotes the producer Hank Shockley saying, quote, "We don't like musicians. We don't respect musicians," end quote. Shockley, like many others before and after him in other contexts, is seeking to build some space where he can secure protection from music's abstracting power and voracious appetite. In conversation with Foucault, Deleuze once said that theory ought to be like a box of tools. I take him to mean that theory is less an explanation than it is something to work with. To mix my metaphors, it's been my hope that the horror story I've been writing about music and its growth might turn out to be a decently stocked toolbox. In particular, I hope it contains useful implements for those interested both in music and those interested in non-music. This seems to me especially important in this moment of disciplinary crossing. As the musicologies dance in closer embrace, increased interest in global histories of music and historical ethnomusicology suggest a desire to tell stories about sonic cultures across time and space in ways that chart the relations between them while also preserving their many particularities. And this includes actually particular ways of understanding and telling stories of thinking itself. In this effort, sonic, cultural, and historical crossings are inevitable circumstances with which scholarship will have to contend, both historically and in the present, as we study those kinds of circumstances. As much as the critique of music has prepared us to recognize that in these circumstances, music may not be the only or most important category at stake, I think it's worth building on the negative moment of the critique of music toward a new, positive account of what sort of thing music might be. The concepts I've been working with, real abstraction, growth, discontent, for example, I hope might contribute to that account, one we need, in fact, because of what they suggest. Music is out there, and it might just be coming for you next.
Thank you for that. That was really, really interesting, very thought-provoking. I've got a boring question. Could you go back to the Martin Sissay quote and talk through that a bit more?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, let me pull it up too so I can see it.
Because he seems to be responding to a particular debate.
Yes, yeah. Well, but what's funny is he says that's the wrong debate. So I guess there had been a debate raging somewhere. I actually never found where that debate was that he starts to talk about. People were arguing over whether the Nigerian police band, which was they actually sort of had an orchestra at some point. So it was, even though they called it a band, there was a band too, but they had an orchestra. Well, as he says, about whether the Nigerian police band can render effectively the classical compositions of our music, of our musicians, or whether we need the London or New York Philharmonic. So he's talking about whether Nigerian musicians are good enough to play Nigerian music. But then what he says is that's Nigerian, when we're talking about like concert music here, art music. But he says, actually, this is kind of all beside the point, because the real strangeness here is that Nigerian composers are just writing in Western style, which is already a growth of music in my terms, right? Western art music's arrived in Nigeria. But then he goes on to say what we should actually do is something I think we're familiar with from a lot of contexts, is we should bring traditional instruments, local instruments into the orchestra. Composers should be taking folk songs and bringing them into art music and concert music. And he's a little jealous that it's already happened in Ghana and some other places. So the way I'm reading it is that he's saying, grow music, right? Do even more of this connecting things, make it even bigger. He's encouraging the sort of uptake of Nigerian music and musical things into this big globe-spanning beast that I'm trying to think about.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's some parallels to what we had yesterday. Yeah. Nigeria composers, like
they
don't have a beat.
Yes,
yeah.
right, exactly.
And so that's kind of interesting as well.
And I think he's an interesting example of like, and I use him a little bit this way in the dissertation. He's not a Westerner, right? So and it's not only Westerners who contribute to the growth of this thing. People have all kinds of reasons in all kinds of places for wanting this to happen. Entirely good ones, right? He's got an interesting and good reason to be into it.
Thanks a lot for the paper. That's a great paper. Very nicely engaging the president. I have a question about chronology or maybe temporality. This sort of discourse is something I would kind of associate in a lot of different places with a particular historical moment from the sort of the end of the 19th century up to, well, following that sort of historical juncture. So this sort of question of at what point do people outside of Europe or outside of the West
Sure.
bracket at what point do they accept this particular vision? So that seems to be something that happens pretty late, chronologically speaking, in a way that really becomes a part of the sort of discursive landscape in this kind of way. So what sort of happens between early modern colonization and this historical moment?
Yeah, so I think thank you for that question. I think the early modern version of this is just sort of a word I used in the paper, like incipient or just sort of partial and beginning to happen. I think one of the things about the process I'm trying to describe is that it intensifies over time. So I think of a case like I think it's in 1493 that the king of Congo converted to Catholicism, and there's 91. Oh, it's the other. Yeah, I know it's around 1492. Yeah, that's how I remember it. Yeah. But you remembered the right direction to go. Yeah, yeah. And there's interesting descriptions and evidence of the adoption of Western music there in the early 16th century and so on. So and welcomed by Congolese. So I think these sorts of things begin happening much earlier, but to your point that it sort of intensifies by the 19th, 20th century. I think we can actually think with this CISA example, it becomes more useful for people to do that at a certain point in history.
Well,
yeah.
Perhaps just a quick follow-up all about it, but it does that not kind of introduce a bit of a sense of inevitability or kind of teleology available?
Sorry?
Does that not sort of introduce the danger or the possibility of there being a kind of teleological process?
I mean, so my answer to this is I think it is a teleological process, and that's what's so bad about it, right? Like that's everything the conventional critique of music says is a problem. I agree is a problem, but I think my point is it's actually happening. It's not in the scholarship, right? Like the way I read, and I have a bit about this in the dissertation, the way I read all that sort of 90s talk about like getting rid of teleological histories, the concern is with historiography. It's with the narration of the musical past. My attempted move here is to say, well, but that's actually what's happening, and that's why it's such a problem. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much. It's really cool because I think it's kind of how I've been thinking on music for a few years, and I've never figured out how to argue and express it so clearly. So it's really lovely. And I think to me the interest is always like reading stuff outside of music to figure out where the critique of this was, and you found it like inside music literature, which is super cool. But so I guess the question is, you just mentioned kind of narration in the 90s stuff and kind of the anti-teleology being a narrative thing. I'm very curious whether the horror story dynamic is actually part of your thesis, or if that's just a thing you did for this theoretical version. And also just kind of what other literature is your drawn. So I think of like, have you read John Cruise's book culture on the margins. George Lewis, it's like about kind of like slave song and how like slave songs were taken on by like white abolitionists as like evidence of humanity, those kind of things. But yeah, I'm curious what the literature and what the actual larger distribution form is.
Yeah, so I do the horror story thing a little bit. I think it works as a framing. Yeah. What other literature is in here? You mean like sort of?
It's so curious what how you put it all together in the end, yeah.
So Glissant was mentioned like very briefly. He's sort of important at more length in the dissertation, and then there's a ton of literature on real abstraction that I didn't cite. Just kind of give you the Cliff's Notes version. So that's really important. There's also literature on growth that I work with a little bit, and that stuff I assembled from a bunch of different places. I consider some ways people have been thinking about growth in like anthropology. There's a couple ethnographies that I think about there. Obviously, like a sort of political economic thinkers who are concerned with growth, and then finally ecological. And so that goes to maybe just the last kind of body of literature that I'll mention for now. This part isn't done yet, but I want to conclude the project by engaging with the literature on degrowth, the ecological and economic movement of degrowth, because I wonder what that idea has to offer, if I'm right that this is what's going on, right? And maybe what we need to do is degrow it.